Hi, I'm James Kahn, and these are my stories. And this is my E.T. story. One day I was working in an emergency room in Santa Monica when we got a call from a woman asking if we could help her figure out how to resuscitate an alien. We said, sure, come on down and we'll show you. So she came down. It was Kathleen Kennedy. She came down with Melissa Matheson, who had written E.T., and we gave them a demonstration of how we would do it. I lay down on the gurney, pretended to be the patient. Murphy pounded on my chest doing CPR. He was a little rough. He was a Vietnam vet. He had maybe a little bit of what we would now call PTSD. It's not quite controllable all the time, but my ribs didn't break and everything worked out well. And they said, great, that was very dramatic, you're hired. So Murphy and I and Alex Lamponi, who ran the ER, and a bunch of nurses went down to the set of E.T. at Laird Studios, which is right next to MGM, and it's where Gone with the Wind was filmed. So we got there just as the resuscitation scene was setting up, where poor little E.T. was dying, and they dressed us all up in hazmat suits, and we were all the extras in that scene, and we ad-libbed, shouted medical orders and jargon. We were doing that, and I ran in at one point. You can see me here. I'm the last doctor running in with a clipboard in my hand because I was meant to be recording. I was the logger of the resuscitation. So we were doing that, and obviously, between takes or setups, we got to meet Spielberg. Spielberg was a terrific director, by the way. I was especially impressed by how he directed Henry Thomas, who played Elliot. He used to get down on his knees and talk to him face to face to direct him in a scene. It was really moving. There was actually a lot of downtime between setups, so Alex Lamponi, who ran the ER, and I used to give piggyback rides to Drew Barrymore. So I had girded my loins and taken in my first published science fiction novel, World Enough and Time, illustrated by my wife, artist Jill Littlewood. Got all my courage in hand and gave it to Spielberg and said, I know this is really forward and people must be doing this to you all the time, but would you consider making a movie out of my book? So he said no, but he said he'd be happy to take it and put it on his shelf, and someday when he had time he would read it, and we both knew what that meant, and I was very grateful for that much. So we went back to shooting the rest of the day, and then the next day after the first take, a PA ran out to me and said, Mr. Spielberg wants to talk to you. And I thought, oh shit, I'm in trouble. Either I looked in the camera that time, or I screwed up the scene somehow, or he was really pissed off at me after the thing with the book. So I went in to see him, and it turned out he said he realized when he got home that my book was already on his to-read shelf because it had been given to him by his dear friend Lorraine Gary. And so she gave a copy of my book to Stephen, and it was on his shelf, and he thought it was fated that I was here now, and I gave him my book, and he already had the book. So I said, so now do you want to make my book into a movie? And he said no. But he did offer me the gig of writing the novelization of Poltergeist. But there was one condition. I had to write it in 1 month because they were behind schedule in post-production. So I said, okay, deal. And I went back, I got out of my hazmat suit, I went back to the ER and frantically called every doctor I knew to cover all my shifts in the ER that month. And the next day I started writing at his offices at MGM. So it was actually, he had a suite of offices, and I was ensconced in the conference room, which had a big conference table. That's where I wrote. No computers in those days. I wrote on a longhand on a spiral notebook, surrounded by old school video games, console video games like Missile Command and Centipede and Donkey Kong. And I got really good at Missile Command during frustrated writing periods. And then in the next room, they had hired a woman named Marcy, who was my transcriber. There were no computers at all, but she was there with an IBM Selectric typewriter, and every few pages I would write, I would give it to her, and she would type them out. And she was in a room across the hall, so I wouldn't hear her typing to get distracted. So I could just get distracted by Missile Command instead. So we went along that way, and it was exhausting. I wrote every morning from 9 in the morning until about 9 at night. And in fact, on Thanksgiving morning, I got there, and the only other car in the parking lot on the MGM lot, was the guard's car at the guard shack. And as I walked past the guard shack, he said to me, "Oh, you must be one of them, whatchamacallits, one of them overachievers." So I kept writing, and I finished a first draft after 2 weeks, and I gave it to Frank Marshall, who was the other producer and my liaison to Stephen when I had questions. And they loved the first draft. And I asked if I could add additional material when I did the rewrite, and they said, sure, whatever you want. So I added a bunch of stuff from my real life experience with my research in ESP at the University of Chicago Sleep Lab. But that's a whole other story I won't get into now. So I wrote, and I added all that material for the second draft, and then I was getting towards the end, and I wasn't sure I was going to finish quite in time. I was just really exhausted and writing all day, every day. And I went in the morning. It was a cloudy, kind of drizzly day, and all day. And I was writing, and by nighttime, it was like full dark. It was still just kind of cloudy and drizzling. And around 8 o'clock at night, I had just finished the line, "Thunder and lightning ripped the sky." It's on page 293 of the paperback novel, if you want to look. And as soon as I finished writing that, this gigantic lightning bolt and thunderclap hit the building. I kid you not. All the lights went out. The front of the window air conditioner blew off across the room and almost hit me. Marcy screamed in the other room and ran in. We said, "What's going on? What are we doing?" And then a few seconds later, the lights went back on, and all the video games started playing themselves. Swear to God. So we just ran out of the building and left for the night. At the E.T. wrap party, Stephen told me it was the best novelization of any movie he'd ever made, neglecting to mention that there had been no other novelizations of his previous movies. So I thought, again, that was very nice of him. And then later I went to the house, Jill Littlewood, my wife, and I went to the house of friends, Mark and Sue Ratkovic, and I wanted him to read one scene that I'd written in the novel that hadn't been in the movie, and that was the spider scene. And it was a scene that had freaked me out so much while I was writing it that I had to keep getting up in the midst of writing it and walking around the room. It was just so creepy. And the scene was about one of the researchers who walked into the kitchen of the house, and he was suddenly frozen. He couldn't move. All he could do was see armies of spiders walking across the floor towards him. And they started walking up his pants leg and inside his ears, and spiders. More arrived slowly. They came forward, black and yellow ones, brown fuzzy ones with violin markings on their backs. One of the nearest ones darted ahead and slid out of Marty's field of vision. He couldn't even scream. He felt it crawl up his ankle, skittered up his right leg. One burrowed into his right nostril. One crawled into his mouth and started laying eggs in his throat. So obviously totally creepy. So Mark, my friend Mark, was reading this, sitting on the couch, and he just finished reading that scene when all of a sudden a spider dropped off the ceiling onto the page, and he slammed the book shut. And to memorialize it, and to show you I ain't kidding, here's the manuscript, and there's the spider. So that's my last Poltergeist story, and that's my E.T. story.